Women, they don't want to stay at home when you pull them. They just want flexible working hours and flexible working conditions like you have. And I think we should all advocate for that. It's not one or the other. But when you sit here and you go, you'll be more fulfilled doing this, then spend all your time doing that. We would love for you to leave the public eye and go focus on what makes you fulfilled.
Okay. Hi, my name is Candace Owens. I am a podcaster, a mother, a wife, and also the author of the upcoming book, Make Him a Sandwich. And today I am surrounded by 20 feminists. My first claim is that the sexual revolution has devalued women and made them infinitely less happy. Hi.
Hi, I'm Samaya.
Samaya, nice to meet you. I'm Candace.
Nice to meet you too. So my question for you is, statistics show that 60% of women who are murdered by their intimate partners, murdered by someone that they are in close relations with. That's according to the UN from 2023.
Yeah.
So how is it that, women are so valued, quote unquote, in the home, and yet that's the place where they're at the most danger?
Okay, so I'm not sure what that has to do with the sexual revolution.
Right, the sexual revolution.
The first claim.
The sexual revolution gave.
I'm happy to answer it. I'm just saying that, if you broaden that statistic, you are more likely in general just to be murdered by somebody you know. So, of course.
But men are much less likely to be murdered by, their
That's not
partners.
true.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, I'm sure, because men are less likely to be murdered by women. Full stop. Yeah, exactly. So that statistic makes sense to me. I'm still not sure how this correlates to whether or not the sexual revolution
increased women's ability to leave the house, women's ability to control their own reproductive capabilities, women's ability to, control their own capacity within the workforce in regards to their own sexual capacity. So it is the very fact that the sexual revolution happened that made our access to the workplace much more, or just the public sphere in general, much more easy. So without the sexual revolution, women would be much more confined to the place where they're at the most danger. Isn't that true?
So you think that, just so I'm trying to understand your argument here, you think that if we didn't have the sexual revolution, less women or more women would be murdered? Are you saying that women are
more women would be murdered, for sure.
Okay, I disagree with that. I still don't think it has anything to do with the claim that women are infinitely less happy because of the sexual revolution, which has devalued women.
I think you'd probably be less happy if you're being murdered.
Oh.
Anyone disagree?
Okay, yeah, I don't, okay. Okay. There is definitely a correlation between personal relationships and domestic violence. And just to be clear, if we're talking about just a monogamous relationships, the most violent relationships that are on the books are between lesbian partners. Yes, when people are intimate,
that's not a true
that is actually true.
No.
So this is an interesting one. So is the claim here that encouraging via the sexual revolution more intimate relationships that are short-term, fleeting, and don't end up in a long-term committed marriage, is that somehow going to magically reduce the number of opportunities for women to be abused physically, to be in these violent situations? Let's think about this logically for a second. Let's say 90% of people in 1925 were in monogamous relationships. They had one, maybe two partners, their entire lives, compared to, let's say, only 20% today, where that other majority portion, instead of having one or two partners, has had 15 or 20. Does that increase the number of opportunities for women to experience violence or reduce it?
Domestic violence. Lesbians, yes, are more likely to have faced domestic violence, but that's because they typically came from relationships with men in which they were mistreated.
Lesbian relationships are the most violent relationships that we have on the books.
This chick just said that essentially women become lesbians because they experience bad interactions with men. That's kind of what she just, if you read between the lines, she said that the statistic that Candace referenced was a consequence of those lesbian women having come from relationships with men in the past where they experienced violence. The implication there being much of their reasoning for becoming lesbian was because of the bad experience they had with men, as opposed to something biological, which the data actually supports, by the way. Something like 27% of same-sex attraction can be attributed to biological factors, whereas the remaining 73% is social pressure. It's nurture, not nature.
Statistically, they can fact check that claim. The point being is that it's not exactly a stunning statistic to say that when people are in relationships, period, whether those relationships are homosexual, whether they're
But
married,
you're saying that the sexual revolution.
Let me finish. I've let you try to explain how this is correlated to happiness, and I don't think it does. I actually think you're having a different debate right now. But yes, absolutely, it makes perfect sense that you are more likely in general when you are in a relationship, because people are driven by anger by people that they know, whether or not we're talking about boyfriend and girlfriend, a husband and a wife, a husband and a husband, or a wife and a wife. Yes, of course, the instances of domestic violence are going to take place when you're inside of a home. But the sexual revolution, encouraging women to give up their goods for free, which is what I'm speaking about, and encouraging men not to marry these women or to have long-term relationships, what I am saying is a direct contributor to their unhappiness, because women are giving up their goods for free and women are now entering the workplace, and that does not actually make them happy.
Okay, pause. Sorry, you've been voted out by the majority. Please return to your seat.
Hello.
Hi there.
How are you? I'm Candace.
Nice to meet you. Julian, my pronouns are they, them. It's very interesting to think of it when we just think about the gender binary. It's how do we place value on human beings in general? And so when we think about, placing value, that comes from a place of power, right? So I think let's select like the Victorian era. You have this dominant group of people coming from white supremacy, deciding who gets to have a proper status in the world. And so that is already like taking human beings and devaluing them. And so what the sexual revolution did was to help people seek out empowerment, which increased value, no matter the gender. So when it comes to sexual revolution, let's look at one contribution is sex education. I'm actually an educator. I teach sociology and LGBTQ studies. And I have absolutely seen the positive outcome with the sexual revolution and sex education, and seen people empower themselves. And with that comes safety when it comes to decreasing STIs, abuse, sexual assault. Again, people get to empower themselves of all genders. And I know earlier you mentioned about violence amongst lesbians and sapphic community, which I do identify within. All genders can be subjected to violence.
That was the point I was making. So I wasn't sure of how her claim was relating to what we were talking about, whether or not it makes people happy or unhappy. Relationships are obviously a ground where there can be violence.
I guess I could just wrap it up by saying, like, if we all have access to like sex education through the incredible work of feminists through the sexual revolution, we are able to gain access to information and gain skills to create an equitable society, egalitarian, within our relationships, whether it be platonic or romantic. I'm so grateful for those feminists who have fought for us so we can gain those spaces and create a healthier society.
Okay, are you a believer in the government doing everything that it can to make people happy?
So when it comes, as someone that teaches in the public sector, I understand the concern when it comes to like, what is a teacher, what kind of information they're providing to the students. I do believe that we, as a teacher, I should be able to give that sort of information. Again, I teach college students. One of my claims is I believe that we should mandate sex education amongst college students. So yes, I do want the state, I would like the government to give us those resources so we can implement that curriculum.
Okay, you consider yourself a feminist, I'm assuming?
A queer feminist. There's variations, right?
What is a queer feminist as opposed to a feminist, just so I understand?
Well, so I heavily believe in queer theory. So, the gender binary that we understand, it comes from colonization. So someone who is mixed race, family from Mexico, we have the Muxés in Mexico, which is an indigenous tribe. They believed in gender fluidity. And then you have European colonizers coming who dismantle that.
A little bit of a helpful rabbit trail or a side note to help sort of inform the conversation when you're listening to people who are more politically progressive when they're talking about these different social issues. When we have belief systems, those systems are predicated on prior beliefs which inform the more immediate beliefs, right? There are tertiary beliefs that we use to construct the framework through which we understand the more immediate issues that we're dealing with. So the progressive movement, they see most social interactions as a sort of game of oppressor versus oppressed, okay? It's a power dynamic thing. So much of this is caused by a more fundamental belief, where they think that the way society is structured is entirely a consequence of the subjective determination of those who just happen to be in power at the moment, right? Rather than a biologically determined outcome that just makes the most sense innately. That has big implications. You're going to watch it play out here in just a second, where this person is, or you just did rather, and they're going to talk about it a little more, where they're saying, the way that we understand gender is a social construct and has nothing to do with biology or anything that we ought to acknowledge, but rather if we place enough different social pressure on the system, we can effectively change the way that human beings behave and operate without negatively affecting the outcomes. This, of course, again, it relies on believing that there isn't an innate biological component to these things, or at minimum, to be generous to them, that the biological component is so insignificant and plays such a small, meaningless role that with enough social pressure, we can just overcome it. When people like Jordan Peterson talk about the most egalitarian societies, the Nordic countries, I believe, he talks about how they have gone further than any other modernized society to create external pressure in order to try and close the apparent gap between men and women in the way that they each behave socially. What he said you have found is that when you superficially create all of these pressures, or let me be more generous. When you, let's use their language, when you remove all of the barriers, okay? When you remove all of the quote unquote barriers that exist that limit the way that women can go out and interact in the workplace, what you actually find is that upon having the ability to make decisions about what they will do, independent or as minimally considerate of external oppression, oppressive factors as possible, they end up making completely different decisions than men. So the fields they choose are entirely different, right? So what that says to us is that there is a clear, innate biological difference between men and women, and the interests of men and women are not entirely biologically determined, because that's just not how human psychology and sociology work. There is a social element and there is a biological element. The biological element, though, happens to be the foundational part of it, from which the social then sort of rounds off the edges and takes its most various specific form. But it doesn't overpower or ignore the biological element. So you have let's say, and it seems to be the case, there's a lot of human behavior which, if you break it down, and there's companies that do this. I watched a video, Lila Rose had a guy on the other day, and it was actually in the context of homosexuality that they're talking about this. And they mentioned several other things like religiosity. You end up being something like 30% biologically predicted to engage in homosexual behavior, or it's a little bit more than that, I think. Or no, it was a little bit less. I'm sorry, it's 27%. Whereas like being religious was like 32%. So it was still a big chunk was biologically determined, and then the way that sort of manifests specifically, it seems, is more a consequence of the time you exist in, the particular environment you exist in. But at no point does the social aspect, the nurture factor, come in and overpower the biological to eliminate its effects entirely. It seems to be the case from the data that when we do that, when we attempt to do that, we cause tremendous psychological damage, which then negatively affects the individual, certainly, but then also society at large. So we can't ignore the biological in favor of the social, but the social needs to complement the biological in order for us to prosper and perpetuate a society which is healthy, which raises healthy children, and then those healthy children engage in healthy relationships, different relational dynamics, not just romantic ones, but most specifically and importantly, of course, romantic ones, because that is the chief mechanism by which human society is perpetuated.
Everything that we understand when it comes to gender is a Western lens. So from a queer...
So you don't even think women exist, I'm guessing.
I think everyone should be empowered to figure out their identity and explore the language that best describes themselves.
All right, see, so that's a complete non-answer. Do you think biological women exist, like as a category, like as a measurable scientific biological category where there is a distinction with a difference between the category of men as understood throughout history, right, what that means, and women as understood throughout history? And that was just a non-answer because they don't really probably even think about it a whole lot, but they definitely try to avoid it if nothing else.
So freedom, America, right? America, freedom. And I want to believe in that when it comes to identity. Right. Everyone should have the freedom to decide how they want to identify, as long as they're not causing harm. But that's where we get into the debate, what is harm?
So just,
right.
Again, to be clear, to go back to this claim, we are debating female happiness. Mm-hmm. You are saying you do not identify as a female.
I identify with all gender expressions, so from masculinity to femininity. So
I'm just saying, are you just saying that as a part of queer theory, you're debating whether or not women are happier after the sexual revolution? I'm just trying to understand, because it seems like you're debating queer theory as opposed to female.
I believe all genders benefit from the sexual revolution.
You've been voted out by the majority. Please return to your seat.
I think it's helpful to clarify, and I think sometimes there's probably intentional strategy in language that's maybe a little bit ambiguous or it's a little bit provocative. I think maybe there's probably a degree of intentionality that's just kind of above my, experience, and there's a reason for it. But I think it's a helpful clarification. Candace Owens, and I think she's going to touch on it for a second here in this conversation. But when those of us that are conservative, especially those of us who are conservative Christians, when we say something like women have been devalued by the sexual revolution, what those on the left hear, because of their particular framework, they hear that you are intrinsically less valuable. You are worth less as a human being as a consequence of sexual decisions that you've made. That's not actually the position that we're taking. And again, maybe there's a reason that, that Candace will kind of let that sit for a second. That way, I don't know. But what's actually meant is that your social value within the context of relational dynamics diminishes as a consequence of your sexual promiscuity. That's just an obvious fact. What a lot of women who want this type of, third wave feminism, sexually revolutionary type of society, what they want to say is, well, it shouldn't matter. But it does. And the opposite sex, when polled, right, this is plainly obvious that they devalue a woman who's had 20 sexual partners over a woman who's had 2 or 3, for instance, okay? So, and also, that's not just because of the gross factor, which is a sufficient consideration in my estimation, but there's much more than that. There is also a consideration for the fact that the more sexual partners a woman has, the less she's able to pair bond with the man who she's with at the specific time, okay, at that current time. If she's had 9 sexual partners before that, and obviously this isn't an exact science where every woman has an exact capacity to pair bond relative to each specific, sexual partner they've had. But in general, when the studies are done, the more sexual partners a woman has, the less able she is to pair bond with her current partner. As a man who's looking for a woman to build a life with, to invest time, energy, commitment, money for years and years and years and years, hopefully, optimally, the remainder of their life, this is a very important consideration. Is this woman who I'm getting into a relationship going to commit to me long term? And does she have the character? Does she have, obviously, the psychological makeup as a consequence of her past to engage in this type of long-term committed relationship in pursuit of deep, meaningful, family building? That's an important consideration. It's not a flippant, oh, you're weird because you want a virgin. That's so embarrassingly unsophisticated that it makes me sad a little bit, but then angry at how stupid it is to think that it's just about the ick factor, even though the ick factor is there and it is, a sufficient consideration. But all that to say, it does absolutely nothing to devalue a human being intrinsically. Like, their moral value doesn't suffer as a consequence of this. And let me even be specific with that language. Their moral value in with respect to what immovable God-ordained value is placed on that human being, right? Now, their moral value, their ethical value within the context of the relationship diminishes, right? Insofar as, well, men are making the assessment that this woman is more morally valuable than another one. There's ambiguity in the language that needs to be fleshed out. And I think sometimes it's left alone to be provocative. But anyway, we'll let them talk about it.
Hello.
I'm Zena.
Zena. Very much like your name.
Thank you so much. Nice to meet you.
Can we start with the beginning? Do you identify as a female?
I identify as a woman, yeah.
Okay.
Right. So I do want to get back to your premise. You're saying that women have been devalued, right, by the sexual revolution. This kind of presumes two things. One, that there has been a loss of worth, right, for women. So you're saying that women have, as human beings, lost worth. Women who, prior to their sexual revolution, were worth more than women today.
I would say that, yes, women have devalued themselves by becoming overtly
According
sexual. That's my claim. So, I mean, also according to and let's not remove this from the other part of the claim, which that it has made women infinitely less happy.
Right. So are you saying, but you're saying that according to you, women have been devalued?
Not according to me. According to the time in which people are getting married, how difficult it is for people to find a partner that's willing to commit to them. And I think that's in large part due to the fact that women are offering sex for free, because it was a major component of the sexual revolution was this idea.
So a woman's worth is tied to her sexuality?
It's not tied to, well, absolutely. If you're going to be having multiple partners, you are going to be devaluing yourself.
You're worth less. So a woman's worth is tied to her sexuality?
It's not tied to, well, absolutely. If you're going to be having multiple partners, you are going to be devaluing yourself.
You're worth less as a human being.
Not as a human being, just, in terms of trying to have a partnership and a productive relationship. Certainly men are not going to be clamoring to have a relationship with somebody when the market is throwing them.
A man's response to your actions is what defines your worth, right?
Yeah, well, I would say that I would argue that what makes women actually happy is family. So if you're interrupting, so just to connect the dots for you, when women are having sex with multiple partners, it devalues them for men, right?
For men. So,
yes, so
men define a woman's worth.
Well, I would say both of them kind of define one another's worth, because I think the ultimate goal for people to be happy is actually family.
Okay, so you're saying
Not
in all cases, a woman is going to be more fulfilled in regards to family.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
And this.
Okay. and look, these conversations are awesome. They need to happen because again, your ideas have consequences. Your belief systems determine how you're going to operate in society. And when you misunderstand things that are this important, it causes you to make very, very important decisions very, very poorly. This girl is absolutely, she's very upset that Candace would even suggest that men determine the value of women. I just have one very simple question. If men don't determine the value of a specific woman within the context of their relationship, who does? Who does? As it pertains to mate selection, okay? With it specifically, I'm not talking about intrinsic moral value, worthy of protection, worthy of life. That's not what I'm talking about, and that's not what Candace is talking about. With respect to a relationship, a long-term committed relationship, who else would you have determine your value for as a mate that is worthy of being selected, other than the man who was doing the selecting of you? Who else would make that determination? And obviously, the reason that's important and the reason it should matter to women in general, again, not every single woman has to end up getting married and having children. There's going to be exceptions. But why that should matter is because the chief mechanism by which human society is perpetuated is men and women getting together and having children. And some relatively radical people will go, well, we're going to get to the point where we don't need men to reproduce and all that kind of stuff. And, you even don't have to have it right now today. Okay. But then we have to be sophisticated. Do those relationships, do the relationships between same-sex couples or single parents, for instance, do they produce healthy children? Do they produce as good a group of children as a two-parent, healthy, monogamous, committed relationship does? No. Every single bit of the data says no. And so it's frustrating for me when, and we're going to get into this in a little bit too, where in order to try and prove Candace wrong, and this is something that people on the left do a lot, and people on the right do it some too, but it's people on the left do it a lot. In order to prove the general rule that she's just observing and like declaring, in order to prove it wrong, they cite exceptions. And the problem with that is when you have a position of influence, you have an obligation to those who go after you, to the next generations, to those who maybe aren't as far along in life as you are, to say, hey, I've gotten to this place. I can see a little more clearly than you. And here's what you ought to do. And the ought comes from a truthful consideration for the implications of the various choices that you're able to make. So if one choice has an 80% success rate and the other choice has a 20% success rate, you ought to take the choice that has the 80% success rate if you're a rational human being that wishes to maximize success amongst the next generation of people. So a very silly example, but it's just true. It absolutely maps. If you had 100 people walk across the street blindfolded, 4-lane highway, 2 or 3 of them might make it across without getting hit by a car. Sure. Great. So then should we encourage people to do that, even though 97% of them were hit by a car and died? It's illogical. And when you say it that simply, it demonstrates how stupid it is that when people who are being good faith, who are genuine, are saying, hey guys, we're not saying it should be illegal to be promiscuous and have 33 sexual partners. But what we are saying is it appears that maybe you guys have run a miscalculation. You guys might be overvaluing something which is of far less intrinsic moral value than another thing. And as a consequence of you doing that, you're experiencing worse outcomes and you're frustrated, you're disillusioned with the whole marriage thing, with society in general, the American dream and all of that. And it might be the case that we've selected a bad algorithm to run and we're simply saying, why don't you be the group of people who doesn't walk across the street blindfolded and hope for an outcome that's statistically improbable? That's all we're saying. That doesn't seem like that violent or that disrespectful or that hateful, compilation of rhetoric. It's just, hey, guys, we care enough about, of course, our children and the society they live in. So we want to, yes, propagate good ideas that are going to help frame a society that makes behavior which is more optimal better than one which makes behavior that's more optimal more difficult, right? We want to make that simpler for our children and for our children's children, but also for those of those people who we don't know personally. We care enough about society. We care enough about human beings. As Christians, we care about the perpetuation of humanity, so that those who are born and who come to exist hopefully come to a knowledge of the saving truth, and all of that. So that's all wrapped up in there. There's obviously the eternal aspect of it, and there's the immediate social temporal aspect of it, where we want a good society. We want to bring optimal beliefs to society that help people optimize their lives. It's not complicated. It's not an assault on people's intrinsic moral value, right? We're saying, hey guys, look, actions have consequences. Good actions, which are informed by good beliefs, have much better, statistically speaking, not 100% of the time, statistically speaking, better outcomes than the bad beliefs, which inform bad decisions. Those have bad outcomes, generally speaking.
This is going to work in all cases. You're saying there's no individual case in which a woman can feel, fulfilled without being tied to other people in the case of family.
I think there could be an exceptional case for everything. I think there are exceptional cases, but I think that if we all start trying to be the exception as opposed to recognizing the rule, which is that people in life are more fulfilled when they achieve a family unit and when they have children, women in particular, especially aspiring to children, then you are going to end up with a bunch of people who are unhappy because your job cannot replace the feeling of having a family.
So what you're saying is we need to look at every individual case and see what is going to fulfill you, or what is going to, I guess, essentially predict your happiness more. Because if we look at, for example, the Nordic countries, right? These are countries.
All right. So yes, but it's a fool's errand to suggest that after, I don't know, what have there been 40 billion people exist so far? I don't know. After billions of data points that have finally established for us what the general rule is, what we ought to do now in 2025 is, well, let's, instead of looking at what's generally true for all of human civilization, let's see if we can pick out a couple of exceptional examples and recreate those for what purpose? Why is there such a deep ideological commitment to this the feminist movement, right? And all that's tied up in that. Why is there such a deep commitment to that we're willing to dispense with long-term social benefit, long-term social prosperity, even individual personal fulfillment and happiness? Why are we willing to do that? That's a question we need to ask. Why are there so many people who are so ideologically captured that they're willing to sacrifice deep, meaningful, positive, real, beneficial experiences in the immediate and for society at large in order to hold on to these ideological commitments? Why? For what reason? For what benefit?
Talking about like Sweden, Denmark, right? These countries tend to be I think in the past 14 years, they've been ranked as the highest in happiness and marital satisfaction from women, right? And we see that they also have been the most open in regards to sexual norms and sexual roles, right? So, and we also...
All right, so this chick's smart, but she's a little bit intellectually dishonest. So she's gonna press Candace on the whole correlation causation issue and say, well, you're going to have to demonstrate how that particular, set of data that you're citing is causal, right? But she's doing the exact same thing right here. So it is true that Finland, Denmark, Iceland, Sweden, and Norway consistently rank highest in the World Happiness Report. Okay. There are dozens of differences between those countries and our country. And to say that it is a consequence of the fact that, well, they are a little bit more sexually promiscuous than we are, which that's, first of all, we're going to have to see some data on that. I reject that. The United States is the #1 exporter of pornography. We are sexuality for the world. So I reject that wholesale unless you're going to show me some data to support that. But I can right off the cuff tell you that these countries are far smaller. They don't do mass immigration where they're this huge melting pot of different ideas. They are far more ideologically homogenous, socially, morally, ethically homogenous than we are. And those things are known markers of happiness and of social cohesion. So just right off the cuff, that's just not an honest reporting or an honest interpretation of that particular statistic. That is reaching if I've ever seen it.
Also see that there's less rates of like STDs reported. We see more, and that's also due to comprehensive sex education that's pushed in those countries. So we see that and that's like a direct result of the sexual revolution.
All right, so just bald-faced declaration, so because this group of people happens to have lower STDs, lower reports of STDs than our country. First of all, that certainly causes us to question her first claim that they're more sexually promiscuous or sexually free than we are, right? That doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. But to say that that's a consequence of the sexual revolution and sexual education is just a claim. It's just a declaration. She can't cite any evidence of that at all. Again, what we can cite is those countries' cultural, their ethical, their ideological, their moral homogeneity. What that means is that group of people, they all share similar values. And when you live in a society that shares values, where you don't have a ton of competing, wildly, at odds values, it makes for more social cohesion. It makes it where there probably are going to be healthier relationships. I would venture to say, I bet you if you look at their marriage statistics, I'll tell you what, let's just do it. Let's do it real quick, right here in real time. Yep, they have lower divorce rates than we do. So there you go. So yeah, And again, that is almost certainly a consequence of, sure, differences in culture. We've tried to, in our particular brand of feminism, make it cool to like leave your marriage, and it's this thing that gets celebrated in a lot of situations. And sometimes rightfully so. Sometimes the marriage should be left. Sometimes the guy's an idiot and he's abusive and he's a fool and he's disqualified himself as a husband. But let's be really honest. A lot of times it's just, well, I'm not happy. You're not making me happy. And this culture has told me that the chief aim of my life is to ensure my own fleeting happiness moment to moment. So again, this girl's not being, and it's either ignorance or intellectual dishonesty. The fact that she's able to recognize the potential logical flaw in what Candace is saying. Potential, not certainly, but the fact that it doesn't perfectly follow that because X, Y. The fact that she's able to call that out and recognize it with what Candace is saying tells me she recognizes it in her own argument. She's being intellectually dishonest.
Right. So when we're seeing that direct reports of happiness, right, we don't have these same rates in America. In these countries that are more sexually open, why would we see like those rates in those type of countries?
We just looked and saw that they had lower divorce rates. So they are experiencing a higher degree of success in long-term committed monogamous relationships. Candace could easily say that's why they have higher rates of happiness. And obviously, that is intuitively obvious, guys. It's intuitively obvious that the things which are most immediate and most prominent in your life, when those are going well, you're going to experience happiness at a higher rate, okay? It's just very obvious that the person who you come home to every day, the person whom you find yourself attracted to and then ending up in a committed relationship with, as a partial consequence, a massive consequence of the biological construction of human beings, in that we rely on the building, the construction of those particular relationships in order to bring about our children, in order to perpetuate society. Obviously, that's going to be, a huge marker of our happiness is how those relationships are going.
So I think you might be referring to this sort of mass-produced study that was a part of like a behavioral science study, which said that women were the happiest women in the world were women that were actually unmarried and had careers. No. Okay. Well, there was
reported happiness.
Okay, sure. I'm talking about the same thing. It was reported happiness, but it could be a different. There's tons of studies. The point being is that in 2023, there was this massive scandal where they recognized that a lot of these studies that were being produced, behavioral science, was proven to be a complete fraud. And they were unable to reproduce these studies, and they also found that the data had been faked. The data that we can look at that I think shows, and you can let me know if you agree with this, if women, and under the imagination of the feminist umbrella, were really unhappy when they were in the home, and then entering the workforce has made women happier and infinitely feeling more secure about themselves, we could, I think, reasonably expect that there would have been a decrease in suicide rates amongst women.
You would have to go ahead and show how that correlation, right, is going to be a direct cause of women going into the workforce.
Okay, well, how can we measure? Then you have to give me a way that we can measure happiness. How can we measure happiness? So I would say suicide rates would be a good thing to look at. Drug, alcohol consumption would be a good thing to look at.
Of course, right? But we would have to, we can say, I can say at this point in society, I don't think everyone is happy. I think there's a lot of things that we need to reconcile in society.
That's what I'm getting at.
Right,
So
but we have to look at the cause, right? Why are these things predicted, right? And for example, if we talk about men, there are a lot of things we can look at, right? That tend to predetermine suicide, right? But we can't say, oh, these two things are happening at the same time. This caused this other thing.
Yes, that's right. But I do think that we can objectively say that women who are committing suicide rates more than they were in the 1950s, like it has actually increased marginally. That's not a sign that us entering the workforce suddenly made us all very happy.
How is it a cause of the workforce?
We're also binge drinking at a higher rate.
How's this cause of
opioids at a higher rate?
How is this a cause of entering
because
the
I
workforce?
think women are being put on a pathway aspirationally.
But you're going to have to. You're saying you think this, right? But where's the cause? Like you're not substantiating the claim. You're saying this is what I think. I'm seeing two.
Okay, pause. You've been voted out by the.
See what I mean? Which I like the fact check thing. That is cool. It's helpful. Obviously, it might not be 100% accurate all the time, but I mean, I think they do a pretty good job at checking on that stuff. A little side note, I think that a lot of times the suicide statistics are cited. I don't think that rates of suicide are as good a predictor of life satisfaction probably as maybe like drug and alcohol and like other problematic behaviors are when comparing men and women, because I think men will do that at a much higher rate than women will. That's an unbelievably violent, very, I'm struggling for words to describe it. I don't know that that's something that we could say the same way that like alcohol and pill use and then obviously self-reported happiness are probably much better markers for measuring the respective fulfillment within the sexes than suicide rates. Suicide is a horrific, violent, like it takes a certain level of despair and like mental, obviously a lack of mental health and just I don't think it's ever going to be the case that women will engage in that type of action at the same rate as men will.
Hi, I'm Nikki.
Nice to meet you.
So when we're talking about the value of women on a societal scale and how we view each other, right? When you're devaluing us, you're objectifying us. And follow me, I promise. But rape rates have gone down by about half in the last 20 years, right? So if you're saying we're less valuable now, why wouldn't we be suffering at a higher rate?
So is the argument that you're making, just so I understand, that because women are giving up sex for free, they're not being raped?
Every study shows rape is not correlated with just sexual gratification. It is a power structure.
Okay.
So it is about objectifying and abusing women when you rape them, not about whether or not you want sex. What I am saying is that women are less objectified, so therefore we are being raped less.
Okay, so you think that in today's society, because this is pretty wild for me. In the 1950s, you're saying women were more objectified than today in the land of OnlyFans, the Kardashian clan, and women that are essentially putting up their boobs and butts for free on Instagram. You're saying we finally have achieved less objectification, where women can't even get onto an advertising. You can't even advertise a bag without them having to be naked in order for them to get a career as a model. You're saying, oh great, we've achieved actually less objectification.
So I'm not trying to suggest that I think that the over-commodification of women's bodies is positive. But what I am saying is that when you're going to the 1950s, that we shouldn't put this glazed look of, oh, it was so happy. We had single income households and we got to stay home. We also had a pill popping problem. We also reviewed.
I would love to watch a debate teacher who really deals with this stuff a lot analyze this video. It'd be interesting. That's always helpful. I like watching those videos. You just kind of saw her have Candace respond in a way that was it was such an obvious blow to her position that she couldn't do anything but concede Candace's point in that, well, yes, yeah, you're right, Candace, women are, well, let me not use, I don't want to use more objectified, so let me come up with a different word that makes it sound like I didn't just concede the point. Over commodified. A commodity is an object as opposed to a person. So when you objectify something, you're turning it into a commodity. That's literally, she said the same thing using different words in order to try and avoid the implication of Candace's rebuttal, which was that, oh yeah, I'm completely wrong. So yeah, I mean, love that. Gotta love that. What else did she say? Oh yeah, the other point that she makes is, and again, this just seems like bad faith to me, and it's either bad faith or maybe it's a genuine lack of sophistication. But when Candace says, "Hey, look, in the 1950s," and the reason she's using the 1950s is not arbitrary. It was first wave feminism. It was the beginning of first wave feminism. But when she says, hey, this particular aspect of society, which feminism has attempted to address, has actually become measurably worse since the time that the sort of program was put in place in order to address it. What Candace is not saying is that the 1950s are the chief shining standard for all of human civilization, and we should aim to be exactly like that in every measurable aspect. That's not what she's saying, and I don't understand how a good faith, honest person could watch this video or could hear what she says and actually come to that conclusion. I don't, that's difficult for me to understand or to believe. Were the 1950s perfect in every respect? No. Were the very ills that feminism was attempting to address made absolutely measurably worse as a consequence of their actions? Yes. Which ties into what I was saying earlier. It's our responsibility to say, does algorithm A work best, or does algorithm B work best, or C or D or whatever, so on goes it. And then encourage the next generation to run the algorithm which is most beneficial, which is most effective for accomplishing the goals. That's all that's being said. It's not saying let's go back to 1950. It's just saying, I think the algorithm you guys have chosen to run has made it measurably worse, not better. And all that is a person who's taking an honest look at reality and who genuinely cares about the long-term outcomes of these actions. I don't know why, again, why the commitment to the ideological presuppositions on the left are more important than the outcomes which they produce. Why? Why can't we be outcome focused? Why can't we be outcome focused? If we all could just be outcome focused and sit down to have these conversations and frame them something like this. My goal is not to win an argument or look smarter than you. My goal is to discover what is objectively, measurably best, and then encourage as many people as we can unto that end. Why can't that be the goal?
Maids, like we were seen as a house appliance far more than we were as people. And so when you have that kind of objectification where
Love that point. That's probably a little bit dramatic, but I'll take it. I'll concede the point. Okay. But does a change from that to what we have now, does it represent entirely a better system or a worse system? And here's the deal. Two things can be true at once. It can be true that within the confines of the average monogamous, committed, intimate relationship, the dynamics have gotten slightly better where men are stewarding their role as leader more properly and more in line with what they objectively ought to do than they did in 1950. That can be true, while it also can be true that women are still sexually objectified in worse, more explicit, more socially damaging ways at the same time. That those two things can both be true. You can have certain aspects of male-female relational dynamics which may have gotten better since that time, while also having others that have gotten worse. And I want to touch on this. When we say they've gotten better, what standard are we using in order to measure that those are better? We're appealing to an objective standard there. We're appealing to, when we say it's better today or worse today, we aren't just saying it's better or worse with respect to the 1950s, because we have to have another standard in order to use. We have to have another comparison that we use, another metric that says, all right, I'm comparing both the 50s and the 2020s to the standard. Which one is closer to the standard? That's how you determine which one's better or worse. That's all wrapped up in a deeply Judeo-Christian ethic. So it's interesting that we have, that the particular aspects of male-female dynamics which have gotten better, and I agree that I would agree with that. I would concede that point. I would say they look more like what the Bible was actually saying we ought to do. It looks a little more like that in this particular aspect or that particular aspect, not every aspect. And I actually have a coherent grounding for making that declaration, but someone who doesn't, and I don't know that this girl's not a believer, I'm just making the point in general because her side typically is the secular, anti-God, anti-Bible side. They don't have anything to ground that in. They can't make a coherent statement which says this is better. Better, the word better is incoherent nonsense if you don't have a metaphysical grounding in which to place objective standards.
I think we're facing a different form today, but I think that rape is a signifier of a contradiction to your statement.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
It doesn't make sense, but I do want to rebut it on a couple of points. So first, I just want to say, suggesting that objectification has gone downward since the 1950s is that's just a firm no. That is not the truth, and that's not true.
Wait, so do you feel
hold on, let me answer your second thing. Okay. Second thing, you then brought up, okay, women were at home, but they were pill popping. Well, you then have to acknowledge we're actually popping more pills now, right? So we have actually increased our amount of pill popping. Women are having overdoses on opioids. And on top of that, since I think 1999, by rate, we are increasing our opioid use compared to men. So women are not popping pills less because we're going into the workforce.
The fact that women report higher rates or are reported to engage in pill popping at a higher rate than men doesn't substantiate the claim that women pop pills at a higher rate than women did in 1950. Those things don't. So it keeps bringing up this statistic comparing men and women's pill popping, but not women's pill popping today to women's pill popping 75 years ago in order to try and utilize that as a proxy for happiness and satisfaction with the way that society's going. So let's see if we can figure that out real quick. So they do. Yes, by a wide margin. Women today take prescription medications, including psychiatric drugs, at significantly higher rates than they did in the 1950s and 1960s. Key comparison. But let's see if men do also. Because if men do also, then it doesn't necessarily follow that it's a consequence of... All right, let's see. Okay, so there you go. So yes, men also take more pills today than they did in the 1950s to 1960s, but not to the same extent as women. So women have disproportionately increased their pill popping. If we're using pill popping as a metric for determining happiness, then that's Candace's claim. So she's 100% right to use that. She's well within her right to use that as a citable statistic in her argument.